What cloud? All right. Well, we'll get started then. So we introducing ourselves. I'm Caitlin Christensen. I'm the Assistant Director of Adventure Education at LSU UREC. And my co-host today is...
My name is Alex Heilman. I'm our coordinator at LSU UREC over Adventure Education as well. Thank you all for joining today. Like Caitlin said, I'm the co-host, so I'll be watching the chat. If you have any questions for us, go ahead and put them in there, and I'll definitely be monitoring that, and we'll get to your question as quick as we can.
So kind of just an overview of Adventure Education at LSU. Our program oversees a couple different areas. I personally oversee the trips and clinics and also the equipment rental. And then Alex can explain what he oversees.
So I oversee kind of the other half of our program. So our challenge course and then our climbing area, which is inside the UREC. Challenge course is located outside the UREC, but can also go pretty much anywhere on UREC camp or LSU campus rather.
And we thought it would be appropriate to cover these topics today, seeing as it is Earth Day. It's also the 50th anniversary for Earth Day, so it's been going on for 50 years. And we felt like it would be appropriate to come from us because it is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts as outdoor professionals, and also as people who are educating future outdoor professionals, hopefully, with our program. We think it's important to cover these topics and just have it something that we put at the forefront of our programming and something that we try to make sure that all of our participants and all of our staff walk away from their experience with us knowing this information. So we'll get started, if I can figure it out. Okay, so some of the topics that we'll be covering today, we're going to go over the history of Earth Day, and we'll talk a little bit about stewardship and what that looks like as far as outdoor stewardship. And then we'll talk about some advocacy, conservation opportunities, and different protection opportunities that exist when it comes to the outdoors. And then we'll talk a little bit about recreation and COVID and how that looks for us right now and how to do that responsibly. So to start, a brief history of Earth Day. Earth Day started in 1970. It started with a senator from Wisconsin. His name was Gaylord Nelson, and he actually ended up receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest honor given to civilians for his work on creating and then continuing Earth Day. It started again, like I said, in the 70s. It was aimed mostly at college students in an attempt to bring attention to air and water pollution. They wanted to really roll off of the anti-war protests and then also that growing collective community consciousness that was happening in the 70s. So I think it started at a really good time. The first Earth Day ever was in the United States. About 20 million people participated and mobilized across the country to rally and protest and just bring awareness to some of the topics that they were concerned about at the time, which again was that like air pollution and water pollution. Some other milestones in the 90s, Earth Day went global and it had 200 million people participate in over 141 countries. And again, bringing more awareness to environmental issues around the world. As I said earlier, and as you can see, 2020 today marks 50 years of Earth Day, and it is now the largest secular observance in the world. And so there again, their mission is to bring awareness to environmental issues around the world and create education opportunities for people to again continue that like continued stewardship and continued activism throughout the year. So a little bit about environmental stewardship. Environmental stewardship is the responsible use and protection of natural environment through conservation and sustainable practices. And one of the big kind of leaders in this was Aldo Leopold. He was a professor, and then he was also a conservationist. He wrote some texts and some essays, one including the land ethic, which I thought was really interesting. It expanded the definition of community to include not only humans, but all parts of the earth. And he really kind of pushed thinking about our relationship with the earth, and that's not just with other human beings, but with how we interact with water, plants, animals, earth, and how we kind of care for all of that and come together as a community. So with environmental stewardship, we talk a lot about sustainability, and that's kind of a big hot topic these days. So if you want to chat it in the chat group, or if you want to turn your mic on and message and talk to us about it, have anybody found good ways to kind of work on reducing their carbon footprint, or their, just like work on sustainability in their household? I know for me, a couple examples, trying to reduce my single plastic uses. I feel like that's a really big one. Alex says buy used vehicles and utilize reusable water bottles, for sure. Shout out to my Hydro Flask gang. Anybody else have any? Amy turns off all the lights when she leaves the house. That's great. Yeah. Turning things off when you're not using them, unplugging them if you're not using them, carpooling if you have the chance, or using public transportation. Amy also keeps air at high temp as well, making it cooler when they're home. Can y'all see when I pull up that Zoom chat? Is that sharing that screen with you?
No, we can't see that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ashley. So a couple other things. One of the big ones that's talked about, it's a little controversial, but eating less meat is a great way to help reduce your carbon footprint. That doesn't mean like don't ever eat meat, but what it can mean is either choosing one day, even one day a week, or one meal a week, or maybe one meal a day that you decide, I'm not going to eat meat with this meal. I'm going to try and do a vegetarian meal. Meat is one way that we really increase our carbon footprint. And so being responsible about where you're buying your meat, if you can find local or sustainably resourced meat, that's always a really big help. Another big push these days is repairing items. So Patagonia, I know I'm kind of a Patagonia snob. I have a lot of Patagonia gear, but what I love about them is that, you have a rain jacket that gets a hole in it, you can send it to them and they'll actually repair it for you. So trying to repair items rather than just saying like, well, my rain jacket has a hole in it, I want a new one, I'm going to toss this one. Trying to reuse those items, make more use out of them, make them last longer. And then finally, recycling. If you can't reuse an item, try and recycle it. Make sure you're putting it in the proper recycling bin. I know sometimes we struggle with that in Louisiana, but figuring out there are places that'll take certain types of recycling if you have glass or things like that. Oh, and Amy says that Chaco will restrap your Chacos too. I do also love my Chacos. Alex, you want to add anything there?
Yep, so all the things that we've talked about are obviously great. So reusing and repairing things not only can save you some money, but it can definitely decrease the amount of stress you're putting on the environment. There's lots of different things that you can look up for that. This is just a very, very brief overview of that. So if you have questions about that, Google is always going to be your friend. Definitely are lots and lots of ways that you can continue to decrease your footprint that we haven't outlined here. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of research on your own.
Yeah, I almost forgot. Amy was mentioning earlier today too, kind of like sustainable beauty products. Lush is one of the companies that is starting to create lotions and different types of, hair products or things like that that actually don't even come in a container. Or if they do come in a container, you can take it back to the store and get it refilled again. And so that's kind of, again, avoiding using that single plastic use and finding ways to use products without that extra added plastic on it.
And kind of on that note too, so Amy just said reusable pads for makeup removal. That's a really good one that I know is used in my household. Not for me personally, but for my roommate. You can also do that with lots of cleaning products and other things like that. So instead of buying a box of Kleenex every month, using a handkerchief, instead of buying some kind of cleaner that comes in a spray can, utilizing some kind of homemade mixture that you can make on your own. That's a little bit more sustainable and honestly probably a little bit less chemical intensive for you too.
Awesome, thanks Alex. So kind of thinking back to our definition of environmental stewardship, The next part of that was responsible use and responsible practices. And so what we wanted to make sure we kind of talked about during this was leave no trace principles. So Leave No Trace is an organization that has created some principles and just kind of guidelines for responsible use of the outdoors and how we can kind of be better users when we're in the outdoors. I found a really interesting fact. It's actually kind of one of the first things they have on their website too, but 9 out of 10 users of the outdoors don't understand their impact or how they affect the outdoors. So it's really important to be able to take these principles and make sure that people understand them when they're heading out into the outdoors, whether that's walking through your neighborhood, going on a camping trip to a campground, or even going on a remote backpacking trip. You can still apply these principles no matter where you're at. I do want to say Leave No Trace is a really awesome organization, and they do have some really intensive trainings that you can go through and get certified, so you can go on and teach these. I'm not certified to teach these things, but I am going to go through and talk about it. But they've got some really awesome training tools with them as well. So the first one is plan ahead and prepare. So plan ahead and prepare kind of means to make sure that you have taken the right amount of time to plan out your trip. By planning out your trip ahead of time, it gives you the ability to make sure that you're accomplishing goals that you wanted to accomplish and also safely enjoy the outdoors while hopefully minimizing your impacts. If you're prepared, then there won't be those emergency moments where you don't have the item that you needed, or you're maybe in the wrong location, you have to go off trail, things like that. Poor planning can result in bad experiences and then also damage to the natural and cultural resources that you're experiencing. By planning, you can definitely also increase your self-confidence and just allow yourself to have opportunities to learn more about where you're at. So some things to consider when you're planning ahead and trying to prepare, to make sure you're taking into consideration your goals for the trip and also the ability level of the group. You don't plan on going on a trail that not everyone can hike on. Make sure that if you are going on a trail that you've never been on, you either have a map or you know the location of where you're going to be, and definitely gaining knowledge of the area that you plan on being in. And entering into an area without prior knowledge is just a pretty much guarantee that something will probably go wrong, or that you'll end up needing assistance from other people. So making sure that you have those kind of things set out beforehand, before you leave for the trip, before you even set foot out the door. Making sure you have proper equipment. That we'll talk a little bit more later when we talk about kind of more of the equipment side of things, but making sure you have what you need for your trip, appropriate clothing, things like that. And then at the end of the trip, making sure you evaluate your trip, how it went, and make notes for the future so that maybe you did learn something from your trip, which I've had many trips that I've learned things from, making notes on those so that in the future you don't run into that same issue or the same mistake. Some other things to consider, just weather when you're going into an area. What is the weather going to look like? Is the weather going to change while I'm there? Do I have appropriate clothing if it's going to rain? What's the terrain like? Do I have the right shoes? Are there any regulations or restrictions? So that kind of goes into, right now, are there closures? COVID has forced a lot of locations into closures or having restrictions, no overnight camping, things like that. So making sure you've looked over your regulations. Are there any restrictions on campfires? And are there any land access issues? Like, is this private property? Do I have to get permission to be here? Is there a certain, sometimes there's locations at certain times of the year you can't be there because of like tribal practices or tribal religious holidays, things like that. So making sure you have that information before you go. Alex, do you want to add anything on this one?
I think a good one for planning to think about here in wonderful wet Louisiana is, has it rained recently? Is it supposed to rain today? Particularly if you're going hiking, biking on places that maybe don't necessarily have a paved or a gravel path. If you go right after rain, it can really have an adverse effect on those trails. So making sure that you're really checking that weather, or even kind of thinking about what weather we've had within the last couple of days. Has it had an opportunity to dry out? Can definitely set you up for a much more fun trip than if you don't check on that kind of stuff.
Awesome. So our next principle is travel and camp on durable surfaces. This one is just thinking about the durability of the surface that you're traveling on. So are you hiking on a trail that's mostly rocks? Is it sand? are you on an established trail? Obviously, walking and hiking on an established trail is the preferred method. Sometimes, you know, you don't have that opportunity, or maybe you're in an area that doesn't have trails, or there's a light trail, but sometimes you lose it. So when you do have to travel off trail, thinking about the durability of the surfaces that you're traveling on then as well. Are you trampling over vegetation that is going to be devastated if you step on it? You know, what kind of surfaces are you walking on? So some of the really great ones, rocks, sand and gravel, ice and snow, those are all durable surfaces that have minimal impact. When it comes to vegetation though, you walking on vegetation, that is going to cause a pretty large impact. And so being mindful of what kind of vegetation you're walking over. If it's something like you know, dry grasses, that's a little bit more durable, but wet meadows where you're kind of trudging through, leaving giant footprints, we want to avoid doing that. And we also want to avoid creating paths, because then other people might see that path and they might decide, well, I'm going to go take this path. And now we've created this secondary path that is going to just add a lot more stress on the environment and stress on the vegetation. One kind of interesting side to that on vegetation is a thing called cryptobiotic soil. This is usually in desert environments. This is extremely vulnerable and has a lot of impacts if it gets destroyed. So making sure that if you are in an area that has cryptobiotic soil, to be very careful with where you're going, follow footsteps so that you're not creating large areas of trampling of the cryptobiotic soil, because it takes years and years and years for that kind of vegetation to come back. So our third one, the fun one, dispose of waste properly. So this is anything from, and you'll probably hear it, pack in, pack out. So pack in, pack out is take everything that you pack in what you need and then pack it all out. So if you brought it in, you need to bring it back out with you. This can sometimes apply to human waste as well. It depends on the area that you're in. So making sure that you check your regulations, that goes back to planning ahead and preparing, but making sure you check regulations. If you're in an area where you have to pack out your human waste, you're gonna have to be prepared and have the right equipment to be able to pack that out. There are some really cool tools out there for being able to pack out your solid waste. Just know that you need to look into that before you head to an area and make sure you're prepared to do that. You may also be able to bury solid waste, but again, you'll have to pack out any kind of toilet paper, feminine hygiene products, things like that, you'll have to pack out with you. The other side of that is, as far as garbage goes, be aware that you're going to have to pack it out with you. So try not to bring really messy, smelly garbage. It's going to attract animals. And also with the dispose of waste properly, try to use biodegradable soap as possible. This will be less impactful on the environment when you have to use soap in situations.
Before we move on to leave what you find, for the dispose of waste properly, I think a lot of people do have campers, utilize campgrounds and stuff like that, where they do have established dumping stations for that kind of thing. I always just like to make a note of whenever if you are using a camper, make sure you evacuate that tank at the designated dumping site. Just don't dump that stuff out on the ground. It's a big kind of biohazard for other uses in that space. And then obviously if we have kind of a snowball effect of that, of you dump it, then everyone else thinks it's okay to dump it. We can take a pristine place and turn it into a non-pristine place very, very quickly. So make sure that you're checking those guidelines, again, going back to that plan and prepare, seeing how you should be approaching disposing of waste in those areas that you are recreating in.
Thanks, Alex. So our next one is leave what you find. Sometimes you probably heard take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints. In L&T principles, you actually don't want to leave footprints either. So really don't take anything and also don't leave anything. So leave what you find, and that kind of goes to making sure that you're not taking rocks or leaves, plants, don't pick flowers. There are some actual regulations about this in national parks, that if you're caught taking a rock out of a national park, it could be a pretty big fine. And so just reminding, and it's kind of tempting, you find a really cool rock that you're like, oh, this will be a great memento. Make sure you're taking pictures instead, because you want to leave it pristine so that the next person that comes gets to have that same experience that you had, that gets to see the flower, gets to see the rock, and that you haven't disturbed the place by taking something from it. if you also think about it from a standpoint of if everybody starts taking wildflowers, or if everybody starts taking these leaves, or you know, whatever it may be, then it's going to cause a pretty big impact on the area, and it's going to change the experience for other people. I also, in this one, I like to say, make sure you leave the area better than when you found it. So leave what you find, except when it comes to garbage. If you see garbage when you're outdoors in the neighborhood, in the parks, in, you know, the backcountry, make sure you're taking that garbage out with you as well, and try to make it look better for the next person. Sorry, I'm like pausing for you, Alex, just in case you want to jump in. So our fifth one is minimize campfire impacts. Again, this goes back to plan ahead and prepare. Make sure that you know the regulations of campfires in the areas that you're going. So if there's actually a campfire or a burn ban, which we actually have right now in the state when it comes to large burns, but recreation burns are still okay. Making sure you know those regulations so that if you are like really planning on having a campfire and then you get there and find out you can't have one, you don't have that awkward, like someone's telling you to put it out, or you're getting a fine for having a fire. So making sure you're checking the regulations. And then when it comes to minimizing your campfire impacts, obviously bonfires are going to have larger impacts, so we want to avoid those. Keep the fire small, keep it to existing fire rings, so try not to create new fire rings. We'll go, we were just on a trip in the Appalachian Trail area, or actually no, it wasn't the Appalachian, it was the Smokies. Yes, multiple places, but you'll go to those places and you'll find campfire rings, like 3 right next to each other, and there's really no need to create a new campfire ring when one already exists. So trying to reduce the amount of, if there's one there, use it. If there's not one there, if you can, try to use a fire pan so that you're not leaving big burn marks. Or like once you're done, make sure you burn your fire all the way down so that you're not leaving large chunks of wood that are unburnt. And then if you aren't in an established campsite, try to spread those out after it's put out completely to make sure that you're minimizing. It doesn't look like there was a fire ring there. The other alternative to that is just no fires at all. If you're in a really pristine backcountry area, it is preferred that maybe you don't have a fire if you can help it. Use your stove, gather around a lantern, because fires can be pretty disruptive, and they also can be dangerous. I mean, if you look at California, they frequently have very large wildfires that are started from some kind of campfire. The one exception to this one I always like to point out is in cases of emergency situations, if you have someone who's gotten really cold or really wet, and you need to light a fire, then that might be a case where you need to have a fire. But most of the time we try to recommend no fires if you can help it, if there isn't an established fire ring.
We've all, I'm sure, seen stuff about Smokey the Bear too, and his saying of only you can prevent forest fires. That's very, very true. So we definitely want to minimize those campfire impacts. Fortunately, we don't have a big wildfire problem here in the South or in Louisiana, but in other places where it is a little bit more dry, that is a problem. And most of the time those fires are started by human neglect. So making sure that we're burning in those places that we're supposed to burn, not burning in places that we're not supposed to burn. But if we are deciding that for some reason we need to go outside of an established place, making sure that fire is not going to spread or get out of control.
Thanks, Alex. Last 2, respect wildlife. So give wide berths to wildlife. Obviously, don't try to get up and take pictures with them. I lived very close to Yellowstone, and there were multiple occasions of people putting their children on top of wild buffalo to take a picture for Instagram, or trying to get that selfie with the elk in the background. That's just really dangerous for you, and it's also dangerous for the animal. Same thing goes with feeding animals. A lot of times in national parks, when they find out that a bear has been fed human food, they have to actually put the bear down, which is pretty sad, because now that the bear knows that they could get food from humans, so they're going to be more aggressive towards humans and show up more often when humans are there. So just think about it before you feed wildlife. Another one that I like to talk about is not feeding squirrels. I know sometimes the squirrels on campus are probably a different story, but squirrels in certain parts of the country will actually have a big stockpile of food that they have at the base of the tree for winter. And if you give them human food, they'll take that back to their stockpile of food. Human food actually it rots differently than natural food for squirrels. And so they'll put that Cheeto or they'll put that little piece of apple that you gave them into their food stockpile. And then that piece of food that's human food will actually mold and it'll actually destroy their entire stockpile for winter. So it's kind of sad, but just being careful of not feeding squirrels because any kind of wildlife, but that's another thing to think about when you're thinking about feeding squirrels. That's one thing that will typically happen. With wildlife, make sure that you're prepared to store your food and garbage away from animals. Again, trying not to encourage feeding them because you don't want them, it's a safety thing for you. You don't want them getting into your food supply. If you're on a large backpacking trip and you have a specific amount of food and one night an animal gets into your food, that's gone and you're now in a risky situation because you don't have the rest of your food that you had planned on. But it's also dangerous for the animal. Again, like I said, they start to become dependent on people and that's usually when animals have to get put down. And just remember again, when it comes to being in the wildlife in wild areas, you are the visitor. And so again, respecting the wildlife, giving them space, take pictures, but don't get up in their business to take the picture because that's usually pretty dangerous for everybody involved. And then the final one is be considerate of other visitors. This one should be kind of a no-brainer, but again, just thinking about how you're acting and how that might impact someone else's experience of the same area that you're in. So one thing that I always like to talk about is noise pollution. That could be, someone walking by with a really loud speaker playing their music, and that's great. It's great to be that they're in the outdoors experiencing it, but use headphones. I don't necessarily want to hear your music. You don't want to hear my music. So using headphones is a more appropriate way to enjoy your music in the outdoors. And then also keeping voices down. Being really loud at campsite or being loud while you're hiking can be distracting for other people if you're in an area that's popular for other people. If you're in the backcountry, that could be a little bit different. But again, just trying to keep your noise down so that you're not disrupting other people's experience. When it comes to trail usage, again, being considerate of other visitors, just a reminder that uphill travel has the right of way. And so if you're moving downhill, you'll want to step off to the side of the trail with minimum impact to the off trail, but give them space to come uphill. Hikers need to yield to people who are on horses or who have like pack animals, and then bikers need to yield to both. It is also important to keep pets controlled at all times, and making sure that that's like another way that you're respecting other visitors. Alex, do you want to talk to any kind of other bike considerations?
Sure. So definitely being considerate of other visitors. If you are riding a bike on a trail, you need to pass someone, or you feel like someone is going to pass you. Making space for that person or passing that person in a safe way is definitely good. Definitely making sure that you are aware of the rules of specific spaces. So Caitlin outlined kind of the general rules for everything, but other places might have different things that they want you to follow. Here in Baton Rouge, our Comite River system system of trails, has a couple different rules that are posted outside. So making sure that you're reviewing that before you enter any kind of system or trail so that you know kind of what the expectation is within that space.
Awesome. So kind of a newer addition to L&T is social media. So obviously technology is changing a lot of things. It's changing the outdoors as well. And part of that is what we call geotagging, which is something to be considerate of. With Instagram kind of blowing up and becoming this huge thing, it is important to think of some things before you geotag, which is like you can set the location of where you're at on your Instagram post. So think before you're tagging specific locations, especially areas that are maybe like low use, that if a lot of traffic suddenly comes to, it's going to cause a disturbance. So instead of tagging specific locations, because what will happen, especially with those like influencers that are out there, they'll tag a specific location and then people will be like, oh, I want to get that post for my Instagram picture. And a pretty popular area for this is probably Havasupai. If you've never been or never seen Havasupai, Google it, it's beautiful. But I would say that that's probably one of the areas that's most common. People will see a tagged location of it and then they try to get there. And it just can be disruptive for the area. It can be challenging for communities like those. A lot of these areas are in small communities that have low resources and a flood of people that are showing up, kind of wandering around, trying to find this exact location that someone took a picture of. It can just become an issue. And so instead of tagging one specific area, tag general, so that people have to do the research to figure out where you were at. Within them doing that research, hopefully that means that they're planning ahead and preparing for where they're going and following those L&T principles, rather than just like, well, here's the GPS coordinates of this location, I'm just going to show up, and they actually don't know anything about how to get there or what the area is actually like. The other part of this is being mindful of what your image portrays. So before posting those images, are you practicing L&T principles in your picture? And also, are you practicing, safety regulations in that picture? Like if you're mountain biking and you don't have a helmet on, should you actually post that picture? Just thinking about how that comes across to people who are seeing your images, especially if you have a lot of followers or people see you as kind of an outdoor professional. I try to be very careful of not posting pictures without helmets, life jackets, things like that, because I do want to make sure that I am encouraging responsible use. And so that's something that you should think about when you're posting pictures. The other part of this is using your platform to encourage L&T. So if you're posting a picture, try to encourage those principles that we just talked about, and use that use your voice and your images to help people get more aware of those principles. And then also give back to the places you love. So if you visit somewhere, you take a picture, you post it, maybe try and go and volunteer or clean up. Like I said, pack out garbage that you find, using your pictures and your images and this social media that we've created, using that for good, and sharing that sharing volunteer opportunities with people. All of those things can help kind of leave a better place than what we found through social media. And the last one is don't bully or shame people. So, people will go out in the outdoors, they will post pictures that maybe they're not following L&T, maybe they're not following safety standards. It is important not to use social media to bully people, especially people who are going into the outdoors, because we want to encourage the outdoor use of everybody. So instead of bullying, shaming, turn that into an education opportunity and try to do it without being condescending, which can be hard over the internet because there's no tone, you're sending a message. But again, being careful about how we treat people when we see them not following these practices. And that can go for real life too. If you see someone listening to a loudspeaker or being disruptive, trying to approach it in a calm way, in a polite way that doesn't make them feel bad for being in the outdoors. We want to make sure that we're not coming off as snobs or anything like that. We want to make sure they feel welcome in the outdoors. Okay, well, this popped up real quicker than I meant to, but can anybody think of some environmental issues that are close to home? I've posted 3 here that we'll talk about, but if you can think of any others, or maybe just environmental issues that are going on in and around the area.
Lead, high lead.
Yeah, talk about that, Ashley.
So one of the classes that I'm in is called Environmental Signaling in Medicine, and growing up in New Orleans, or in Louisiana in general, our pipes, the water pipes are made of lead, and there's a lot of lead paint. And so that when it gets washed around, it gets in the soil, and lead has serious health effects to the brain and your cardiovascular health and your bone. It stays in your bone for 15 to 20 years. And so there's very high lead levels in the soil, and after Katrina, when all the lead-based paint. So that's a local environmental issue.
Nice, that's a great example. Anybody else think of one?
The Mississippi River, there's a lot of pollution that goes into the Mississippi River, and as a result, there is actually increased cancer rates for people who live near the river, basically all the way through Louisiana, especially those south of Baton Rouge. It's kind of an issue.
Yeah, that's a great example.
I think that example too is a good illustration of how pollution can kind of compound as well. So the Mississippi is obviously a very long river that basically cuts the whole way through our country in one direction. And so if people are polluting up north and it's eventually traveling down here, it's only going to continue to get worse. So if someone says, hey, it's not a big deal if I dump this in this river here, it's eventually going to make its way down here. If everyone's doing that along the whole length of it, by the time we get down to the Gulf, then we have a really, really big problem.
Well, yeah, and when you think about it, you know, the river cleanses itself, right? So like every few feet it cleanses, but it cleanses it by depositing that stuff on the banks along the way, which then affects people further down no matter what happens.
Mm-hmm.
I also think a lot of it has to do with plants being near the river too, because you have all of their waste, and so that's a combination of probably like water pollution and air pollution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've got 3 examples here. A really sad fact, Louisiana ranked 2nd worst in environmental friendliness out of all of the states, which was pretty sad. I have invasive species here. Does anybody know what that thing is?
That is a nutria rat.
I like to call them the ROUSs, the rodents of unusual size, because they're monsters. So nutria rat is one of the invasive species in Louisiana. So there was actually a study done of the world's 100 worst invasive species, and they found 13 of 100 of those worst invasive species are here in Louisiana. So we have a pretty big invasive species problem, one of which being the nutria rat, but there are a lot of plants and aquatic animals that are also pretty bad invasive species. The other one that I have is the coastal land loss. You know, we're all pretty much aware of this. We actually have that really great department on campus that's dedicated to working on this problem, but the coastal land loss is mainly, and a lot of it is due to human development. Dams and levees reduce the sediment and the flood zones that canal drainage usually has, and then like that dredging and things like that. So Louisiana is actually losing a lot of its coastal area. I believe that you kind of cut off in that image, but that land loss is between 1932 and 2050, I believe. But that's kind of like the already lost land and what's expected to lose as well. And then finally, I have the LSU lakes. This is actually super close to home. It's right on campus, but they're at risk right now because, again, they need dredging and they're full of sediment and they're kind of at risk for becoming basically just like a really murky swamp. Because of the sediment that's in there that's not being moved around, they're really shallow, which is not great for water. That heat, it makes them get hotter easier, and so that heat will allow algae blooms. Those algae blooms kill off they actually like suffocate the fish that are in there. So lots of really gnarly stuff that happens. Thank you. Amy says the LSU Center for River Studies is open for Sundays for tours and information whenever we're open again. Thanks, Amy. So yeah, the LSU lakes are another issue that's actually right on campus that needs attention, and hopefully eventually will get attention. That was just an article right out of the LSU newspaper. So again, going back to that environmental stewardship, part of that is also being, you know, like working to help protect our environment, protect the communities that are at risk, that are impacted by these environmental issues. And so part of that is just getting involved. So there are a lot of ways that you can get involved. One is by getting involved in advocacy, and that can be through finding local advocacy groups that align with your interests and align with things that you're concerned about. You can volunteer, you can spread the word, post on social media, and also support others who are doing similar work that you're interested in. You know, if you get really into it, you can, you know, find a career that allows you to continue working for environmental protection. There are plenty out there. And then you can also just promote awareness and education on topics that are important to you by, you know, just educating people that you come in contact with and making sure that you live a life that you continue to, you know, show that you care about these, and, you know, by making changes in your own life to help protect our environment. And I believe Alex had a couple local advocacy groups that are around here. There's some national as well.
Sure. So just like I said earlier, your best resource for looking for things is definitely Google. So here in Louisiana, we do have the Louisiana Environmental Action Network that does a lot of work helping to protect our environment here in Louisiana, just for future generations and stuff like that. Specifically for biking, we have Bike Baton Rouge, which is an advocacy and education organization just around biking of all types within the Baton Rouge area. UREC, which is our local parks department, does a lot of work in their parks, and with another group that is called BRAMBA, which is the Baton Rouge Area Mountain Bike Association, to work on trails, make sure that places are being cleaned, being well kept so that they can be enjoyed. On a national scale, if you're into water sports, the Water Sports Industry Association is something really good to get involved with. They are big advocates for recreation based in water. The Access Fund is a nonprofit that oversees a lot of different advocacy for climbing specific, or the climbing specific type of stuff. Not super big here in Louisiana, obviously, but if you are a climber, I would say go ahead and try and get involved with them. The Outdoor Alliance, which is something that Caitlin will be talking about here on our next slide, is another great resource just to get more information on what you can do as an outdoor advocate. And then the Outdoor Advocacy Project is a movement for outdoorsy people just to help do stuff and continue to do good in the outdoors.
Thanks, Alex. So last slide and last thing we said we'd touch on is how to get outside during a pandemic. So currently, we're all dealing with just everything going on with coronavirus, and there have been a lot of changes and things change quickly. So this could change, and take these things with a grain of salt. Make sure you're following recommendations by the CDC. But the Outdoor Alliance put this together to just kind of help guide decisions on how to get outside and when to get outside and where to go when you're outside. So making sure that, again, the health of others is your number one priority. Thinking about, the communities that you'll be, coming in contact with when you are going outside. You can go outside, but you need to do it cautiously. So this isn't really the time for like huge road trips. If you are going to go outside, do it close to home. If you feel sick, make sure that you're not going outside and make sure you're following the CDC guidelines. But keep a safe distance from others. And again, like try not to travel super far away from home. A lot of communities, like it says here, traveling to areas, so like say you want to go to Southern Utah, you want to go to the national parks in Southern Utah. Well, some of those communities down there, like Moab, they're small cities or small towns that don't have a lot of healthcare support. And so by people deciding like, well, I'm going to go on this big road trip, I'm going to go see all these national parks, you're actually putting those communities that have limited resources at a higher risk, because now you're showing up there to go see these national parks. So being careful about where you're going. Same thing can be said here for small towns and cities within Louisiana. So just be careful about what you're coming in contact with. If you are going to go out, think about it's like out my door, in my car, trail, and then I'm back in my car, I'm back home. Being careful with how many contact points you make, and just reducing any contact, as much contact as you possibly can with other people. The other part here that I thought was really important that I like that they said is keep it chill. So right now is not a good time to get hurt. The medical system is already stretched super thin. So a big concern is like people are like, oh, I'm going to go on this backpacking trip. I'm going to go to this remote location, or I'm going to go rock climbing, or I'm going to go mountain biking. And think about what happens if you get hurt and what that looks like for first responders trying to help you when they're already in this really burdened situation. And so just kind of thinking like, well, I'm going to, safety first, I'm going to try and be calm. I'm not going to get hurt. I'm going to keep it chill. And then the last one is, again, respecting closures and just being a good steward. So if parks are closed, don't go. I know here in Louisiana, some parks are open, some parks aren't. I know overnight camping is not open right now. So don't break those regulations and don't break those rules. If you do find somewhere that you can go responsibly, make sure, again, you're following those L&T guidelines, packing out what you have with you, and just continue to check closures and making sure that you're keeping up to date on what's going on. Okay, and with that, Alex, unless you had anything you wanted to add.
No, I think even if we just look at this lovely graphic that we have here. I don't think any of this really goes much past what the CDC is already recommending. So just making sure that we're keeping our distance from people, keeping our health and the health of others as a priority is very important. And just make sure that you are doing things appropriately. I think a lot of these can even be kind of tied back into leave no trace. So making the health of others your number one priority. So that's like packing out what you pack in. So making sure that we're still taking everything that we brought in with us and maybe even taking a little bit more out if we can. Going outside cautiously. So making sure you're planning ahead and preparing, making sure that you're saying, hey, I am only going to go from my door to my car door to what I'm going to be doing back into my car. I'm not going to stop and do unnecessary things. I'm not going to contaminate any more things than I need to at this point. Staying close to home. I know it's really, really tempting to go and get outside in this time where things are kind of slow. It's kind of locked down. We all probably have a little bit more time off of work or school than we typically have. But if you're thinking that, there's also a lot of other people thinking that. So really, by doing that, we would probably be making the problem even worse than it is already. And then keep it chill, as kind of hippy dippy as it sounds, making sure that we're functioning within that space that we're comfortable. So now it's not the time to say, hey, I'm going to pick up rock climbing and I'm going to climb El Capitan in the next 3 months. It's just not a good time to do that. Definitely pick up new things, but make sure that you're practicing them appropriately, learning how to do it before you jump into something that is maybe a little bit above your depth.
Awesome. Well, we went a little bit over what we thought we would, so we'll kind of end with that. If you have any questions, feel free to contact myself or Alex at LSU UREC. Our emails are there. And then we've got some resources and some of the web pages that we pulled some of this information from. With that, I think I'm going to stop recording